Science 11, we're approaching the closure of our double cycle of years. And if you choose to exit from the program, there's a 9th section called complementarity, which you can do yourself, and it'll ease you back into the general world from the strenuousness and the complexity of our learning. If you choose to stay in the cycle, the nature phase that follows science will begin it again. But this time, because of a calendar peculiarity, we have one extra Saturday presentation. So the last presentation of this year, December 31st, will be an overview of the structure of how this works and how it came to be. It'll be a reconnoiter of 40 years of actual teaching. And just to give you a précis, the first course I ever had to design and offer myself was at San Francisco State, and that was 1966, and it was on the Hermetic Renaissance. So I find myself 40 years later interested in the same things that those Renaissance figures were interested in, and for the same kinds of reasons. I hope to cease being medieval and to start being contemporary and creative. And I invite you all to come along. One of the advantages that we have is that instead of learning by subjects and receiving instruction from a textbook on a subject, we have recalibrated learning so that it no longer is put into subjects, but occurs in phases. And the finding of the order of these phases took quite a long time. By 1975, I had found that, indeed, you have to start with nature. It's the only starting point. But it was a great surprise to discover and to disclose that nature is not a starting point at all, but is rather a process already in motion and does not have a starting point. That what has a starting point is existential objectivity. And because it emerges whole out of the dynamic of nature, existentiality is always a unity. And that this unity has peculiar property. Anything that comes into existence will always have, for existentiality, its own subset of unity. And the emergence of it whole, the best way to talk about it is the ancient Chinese of saying, the mystery of nature is a Tao, and the emergence of Te, of the power to be, of the stability to exist, of the objectivity to be stable, that always occurs as a oneness. And so all of the universe is of a oneness place, and that oneness place, by the time we get to Science 11, we have discovered that by the early 21st century, we understand that the great lure is to be able to understand oneness in some grand unified theory of everything. And while this has been predicted for a long time to be coming, the closer we get to it, the less it seems that we could be certain that we ever got there, even if we did. The only way to understand this is to recalibrate out of subjects, out of the classic schooling, out of the classic growing up by subjects and grades, and to recalibrate learning completely, at least in the basic maturation part. You can still learn subjects to get a job, to master by instruction, by text, to understand limited things. But in order to mature ourselves completely, the phases are essential. One of the books that we're using is The Nature of Space and Time. And two of the greatest minds still alive on the planet, Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose, argue. And they argue different views of the universe and of reality. And as many people have pointed out, it's as if Einstein arguing with Niels Bohr, relativity arguing with quantum mechanics, continues into the 21st century with Penrose developing Einstein and Stephen Hawking's developing Niels Bohr's quantum mechanics, by now gone through a number of permutations. One of the earliest ones was quantum electrodynamics, QED. The electro is for the electron, the electronic, the electromagnetic spectrum. Not only the electron, but the way in which it interacts with the photon. The particle or wave of light that carries the electromagnetic force, and the electron which carries the ability for the atom to inhabit existentiality in a very peculiar way. The atom could never be stable if it were static, that its vibrancy is literally a vibrational iteration that allows it not only to participate in dynamic energy, but to also participate in cinched, polarized energy as matter. And the atom is a curious, by now a very curious place. It literally, each atom shimmers in a peculiar way. It has a nucleus that if the atom were the size of a football field, the nucleus would be a pea on the 50-yard line in the football stadium. So that the protons and the neutrons at the center of the atom are literally almost a minuscule aspect in size. And it is the electron shell, the scintillating motion of the electrons around that center, that create the layers that accumulate together and create what is ostensibly the existential surface of the atom. And that if you have many, many, many quadrillions of these atoms, they will link together and they will make a material, an element. Several times it's been pointed out that when the photon comes into its interaction with the electron, it comes in such a way that the photon is carrying a frequency, but the atom itself is carrying something related to frequency called oscillation. And what it oscillates as, almost instantly, billions of times per given time unit is that it absorbs energy and it emits energy. And that each atom will absorb an exact quantification of energy and emit that exact quantification of energy. So that one can have an instrumentation, a spectrograph, and one can take light from anywhere in the universe and make a spectrum of it. And you can tell from the spectrum what elements are in that spectrum. And in fact, every element in the universe, every atom, will have this balance of absorb and emit. And it turns out the other book that we're using with QED is, of course, The Nature of Space and Time, Hawking and Penrose. And one of the odd things that Stephen Hawking is world famous for is discovering peculiar properties of black holes, and that at the surface of black holes there is still the phenomenon of oscillation of absorption and emission, though it happens almost instantaneously. And what occurs almost as instantaneously but a little bit quicker is the emergence of a wholeness of an existence in a paired way, a particle and an antiparticle, and the black hole will instantaneously absorb the negative particle and repel the positive particle just a split nanosecond before they would come together and annihilate each other, and that the negative particle will be absorbed into the black hole and ever so minutely increase a property which black holes have that Stephen Hawking's found, that they have entropy. That they have an entropy of running down in their energy, and it constantly increases so that over enormous, unbelievable scales of time, black holes will slightly evaporate, and at some god-awful distant time could explode. The first time that he brought this up, one of the great Oxford lecture halls, the man named Professor Taylor was so incensed that he stood up. He said, "That's nonsense," and stormed out of the lecture hall. You don't do that at places like Oxford very often. The difficulty is that there are three different, equally valid theoretical motions that can be applied. And the three figures that we have are the three varieties. Let's come back to our phases because it's the only way in which it becomes apparent. And when it becomes, you'll see what an interesting kind of three-way dance is going on in terms of trying to understand what is real, who we are, where we are, and how did we get here, and why are we here. Our phases are 8. The first 4, nature, ritual, myth, and symbol, are an integral cycle, and they characterize a cycle of nature which has this kind of repeat cyclicity to it. The other 4, vision, art, history, science, are not integral, but they're differential. So that you have 2 modes that are very similar to absorb and emit. The oscillation between the 2 of these, though, takes place in a very surreal way. because nature has only 4 dimensions in its cycle, is very happy with 4 dimensions, is integrally complete when the 4 dimensions run through that 4-phase cycle, and that its completeness is of an ultimate completeness. And yet, there's something more, something different, something beyond it, so that the 4 phases that are the cycle of consciousness are an alchemical surprise that goes beyond the cycle of nature and becomes an ecology of consciousness. And we've seen in our way of looking at the phases that at any one time there will be a single frame of 4 phases that will be in our attention at any given time, and that this is a calibration that is given to us by nature and by our maturing and developing, not only in our lifetimes in nature, or even in our species in nature, but that all of the natural occurrence contributes to this. So that we have a square of attention that has only 4 phases. So that if you bring the 5th phase of vision into attention, into play, the first of the 4 phases of the natural frame of reference goes out of attention. It's still operating, it's still real, but it's not in your frame of reference. And that first phase is nature. So that your square of attention now, when it includes visionary consciousness, the base of that square of attention will be ritual existence. It will be the body. It will be the sequences of limited actions that produce objective stability as things, as existentials. Stephen Hawking works in that square of attention. He bases himself on the physical body of evidence of existentials, of their ritual objectivity established by what they do, by the force, by the work of actual things in the universe, and that's the basis of his square of attention, which then includes the experience, the mythic experience, and includes symbols, the symbolic mind, and includes vision, visionary consciousness. Those phases always pair in forms of process and form. They always come in that way. And it is the process that allows the emergence of the form. So when nature, which is the first phase as a process, goes out of the square of attention, attention now becomes founded on ritual objectivity, on the body, on existential things. So that the mind, which is also a formal phase, and also has the property of having an objectivity in an integral mode, is able to make a referential identification so that mind and body, the mind identifies the body provides certainty for the mind, and the two of them come together in a logical identification, which does not seem at first to be tautological, but actually at its deepest level is tautological. Tautological means that what you're really saying, you're trying to define A, and you're saying, well, A equals A. But because it is so complex and so universal, the mind by itself will not understand that it has done an ultimate tautological identification of A equals A, short-circuiting, and that instead of learning, you're simply defining. The two processes, nature and the process of myth, is generally called culture, cultural experience. When they're together in the natural frame of reference, culture always participates in the natural process, and when it does, the process of traditional culture is very healthy. It is, in fact, as we would say, using the French phrase, en naturel. And cultures, which are en naturel, thrive in the world of nature. They thrive in the world of existential things. They thrive in the objectivity that can be confirmed by the integral mind. And so everything fits together, and you have this nice frame of reference. But when you bring through some kind of magic, through some kind of transcendence, through some kind of special happening, some kind of unique person, when you bring conscious vision into play, it now takes the place of nature in the square of attention. And when nature goes out of the square of attention, the mind, being objective in its identification with the body, will now have an idea. The idea is that this is real. Things are real, and the mind's ability to index and integrate and organize those things so that experience then makes a good bridging sense between them. And if vision comes into play, experience seeks to bring vision into its ken so that vision will be completely natural and fit into the ordinary. But what has gone out of play, out of the square of attention, is nature. And so nature now assumes the character of an idea the mind has. Generally, in the 20th century, it was called the unconscious. Now there's some kind of unconscious somewhere. And here's our body and our mind and our experience and our consciousness, and we're trying to make ourselves whole. We're trying to integrate ourselves, but the sticker in the works is that visionary consciousness is not an integral process, it is a differential process. And so instead of fitting into the completeness, it always is changing it. Always is looking for new varieties, is always looking to transform. And so instead of having something that fits very nicely in and behaves, you have something which is constantly like a trickster figure. That consciousness, whenever it comes into play, it always is upsetting the apple cart. And the Greek myth that delivered this at a time when consciousness was becoming a huge problem for the classical Greeks in the great age of Greek mythology, which was in between Homer and Pythagoras, the myth of Hermes. And as soon as Hermes is born, he is born as a thief, as a trickster. And the first thing he does, he sizes up the best treasure that he can find in the world, which are the cattle of Apollo, the cattle of the god of whose chariot is the sun. And so he steals the divine cattle of the sun. And Apollo, instead of being angry at him, says, "This is a very interesting kind of thing that you do. And now you should be punished for this, but what have you to say?" And Hermes then says, well, in penance for this, I will give you a musical instrument, this lute, by which then you can make music, and it will have 9 strings, and each one of these strings will be able to bring into play the transforming magic of a new kind of Mother Nature. Instead of being Mother Nature, because she's now out of the square of attention, what will come in are the 9 muses. So that consciousness gets associated not only with the 9 muses as a scalar of the feminine in conscious form, and the 9 muses do not occur in the visionary process, but occur in the form that comes out of the visionary process, and that form is art. So the 9 muses are the patron great cosmic aunts of art, of the arts, of the 9 arts, of dance, of poetry, of history, of epics, of music, all 9 of them, headed by a 10th, which is the god Apollo. And so you have this interesting thing, and in Pythagorean science, you have the 10 dots at the top. The first dot by itself is Apollo. And then the 9 muses follow with 2 dots, then 3 dots, then 4 dots. So that the base of this triangle of 10 dots will be 4 dots. Each side will be 4 dots. So that you have this interesting kind of a triangle that is not a triangle of lines, but is a triangle of 10 dots that occur together as a gestalt. Later on, about 200 years ago, there was a mathematician named Hamilton who decided that one could describe the points of actuality by a gestalt of these kinds of points, and that then would become not a point in a Euclidean way of being a point, but it would be the gestalt of all the aspects of that point in the Hamiltonian. And it's one of the big mainstays of contemporary mathematics. One describes not the existential point, but one describes the Hamiltonian, except that when one goes back to read Euclid 300 BC in Alexandria, because he was a very good Pythagorean, he's not a Cartesian at all. He wasn't talking about a point being some kind of single dot, because the original translation of Euclid reads like a wisdom book should. The first statement in Euclid's geometry in Alexandrian deep Pythagorean wisdom is that a point is a locus of no dimension. In other words, what focuses there is not a focus of existence, but a locus of process that has no dimension, so that it is literally what we would call in physics today a zero rest mass. And only when a zero rest mass locus moves does it then generate a line. And the generation of the line is the beginning of all things. Because that line is generated not quite originally in space, but its movement is a movement in time first. Ever so billions and billions of a time unit before, but a locus of no dimension when it moves, when the zero rest mass moves, it generates a one-dimensional time line, which then always moves forward. It doesn't move backward in nature. And so the arrow of time, as one says, is the first dimension. Time is the first, not the fourth dimension. And as time moves, it moves the locus of no dimension into dimensionality, and as soon as one dimension begins to occur, its line, because there's instantly no space for it, its line is a function vector rather than something. And this function vector, because it has this tremendous dynamic, generates almost instantly the three dimensions of space, and they blossom out of the movement of time, but they blossom out of the first dimensional line linear vector, so that always in the universe you can integrate something by knowing its integral path. And when you come to something which is profound, like modern field theory in astrophysics, a primer, on page 88, the Feynman path integral in field theory. Because Richard Feynman is an extremely important figure. And I'll show you now just exactly why. Hawking bases his square of attention on ritual existence of the body, which is the basis, on the mythic horizon of experience, on the symbolic mind, and on the visionary conscious process. That's his square of attention. Whereas Roger Penrose's square of attention starts with vision and extends to the art, the personal art of the creation, of the creator, of the creative imaginer, the artist. Starts with visionary consciousness, includes the artistic person, moves to history as a high conscious process, and then includes science. So that while Stephen Hawking ends with vision and bases himself on ritual existence, the body, Roger Penrose starts with where he leaves off and goes all the way to the science of the cosmos. So that the only place in all practicality, in terms of phase form, that Roger Penrose and Stephen Hawking agree on is that theoretical conscious visioning is a viable aspect of the frame of reference that they're looking at everything in terms of. For someone who has a Stephen Hawking's square of attention, their ultimate will be a complete realization. But for someone with a Roger Penrose square of attention, they're not concerned with completion. They're not concerned with realization. Their concern is of a differential kind, of the openness, of the perfect freedom of infinity, which is real. And so Stephen Hawking is after realization, like any good integral conscious frame of reference would be, and Roger Penrose is after real, the real. He's after starting what comes out of realization, because what comes out of realization, when the mind is complete, when it is formed, and its structure is very clear, you have a phenomenon best exemplified in planetary history by the historical Buddha. Because the historical Buddha showed that you can be organized by a yoga so complete in the mind that the completeness will come down to a single pointedness at the center of the mind, which is at the center of experience, which is at the center of existence, which is at the center of nature. And that single pointedness, ekagrata in Sanskrit, will be able to wink out. The Sanskrit term for that is, in traditional yoga, is moksha. vanish. So that the integral single pointedness is a singularity that vanishes out of the universe. But when it does, it almost spontaneously, instantly reoccurs, but it reoccurs with more dimensions than nature had before. It occurs with at least 5 dimensions. And so one says in classical Buddhism that there is a moment of enlightenment, and that moment of enlightenment comes a spontaneous split nanosecond after all of the ego, all of the individuality of the mind vanishes in upon itself. Roger Penrose and Stephen Hawking are therefore like 2 squares of only one corner of which touch. Only one phase between the pair of them actually touches. But the phase that is left out of both of them is nature. Nature is not in the square of attention of Stephen Hawking, not in the square of attention as Roger Penrose. Richard Feynman now is an interesting character, because Feynman was concerned all his life with trying to find out who he was, and so Feynman occupies a central square of attention that has both myth and symbol, but it also has vision and art. So he's in between Hawking and Penrose, and his whole purpose is not to be complete or perfect, but to be balanced. And so his balance has a great deal of humor in it. So you're interested in being complete. Well, how are you doing? And you're interested in being perfect. How are you doing? I'm interested in trying to be myself and get things done. And my mind is not linking up to ritual things, but my mind is in a deep complementarity with the artistic person who I really am. And that means that my consciousness now plays with experience. And it plays with it so that it can constantly permutate and go through differential variations and varieties. So Richard Feynman is like a superimposed third square of attention on 2 squares of attention that only touch in one phase, theoretical physics, and don't touch at all in mysterious nature. But one of the things about a square of attention that is myth, symbol, vision, art, is that when the artistic mind is perfectly balanced, it achieves not a vanishing, but it achieves a locus of zero. Not just zero rest mass, but the classic term was emptiness, shunyata. And that shunyata has a direct pivot to infinity. So that at the end of the ecology of science, nature mysteriously reappears, freshened. And where does nature reappear from? Not as a form, but as a process that exudes out of the cosmos. That the cosmos, when it dances, literally makes the dance of nature. And so that Mother Nature is not some kind of matroness who is cooking up some nice food for you, but is the feminine quality of the dance, that existence in its appearance can also be virtually real, though it is not perfectly or completely yet technically real. What makes the reality is the recognition at zeroness in the balance of persons like ourselves, being able to see down the core pivot all the way to the infinite openness, then Mother Nature dances indeed. And time itself is the movement of her dance. Let's take a break. Let's come back to a very interesting fact. In our phases, we have understood that the natural cycle will always have a 0 and 1 characterization, which is why you can represent almost anything in terms of a binary of 0 and 1, and why computers and software and so forth actually work and happen. And in the cycle of nature, this is consistent and true. And virtuality will be able to maintain itself stably, even in an appearance state. Nature allows for appearance to be stable so that images can form of things, and the images can receive a stability. And in the mind, the stability that orders them is the imagination. But the imagination in the mind, though it is the integral form that emerges out of the images that are in the process of experience, they're brought together in the mind in the imagination. When the imagination goes through the symbolic openness of transparency, the imagination shifts to a process again. So that images are a process experience. And imagination is a creative process in consciousness. But they're linked together by the imagination in the mind as a structural part of the form of the symbolic mind. But in order for this to happen, because there is a shear between nature and consciousness, not a shear as a cutoff, but a shear because of a kind of angular momentum. Nature in its cycle, because it is a continuous iterative cycle and extremely fast, develops a rotational quality which is perfectly balanced because of the oscillation, so that there is not only oscillation between absorption and emission, but there's oscillation also in the way in which the rotational chirality of something happens, and so you get symmetry, even in the chirality of things in the universe. They always balance out. So that materia in the universe is not only balanced, stable in terms of charge, positive and negative for electrical, and the polarity of the magnetic, but there's also the spin polarity of the chirality. So that when you characterize, for instance, in quantum mechanics, subatomic particles, you have to include in the characterization of them, the quantization of them, not only their charge and their magnetic moment, but their spin as well. And it turns out that there are a couple of other qualities that are included in this universal symmetry Very, very powerful. But in consciousness, there is a difference which is monumental between the differential mode and the integral mode. So that the forms that occur out of the conscious ecology all have this transformable quality to them. And the quality initiates itself in a pair of an exchange and an interchange. When consciousness comes into play, it sends a quality of its process into the mind in exchange for absorbing, of interchanging with the symbolic mind. And as the imagination goes into conscious process, it becomes creative imagination, or better, creative imagining, out of which will come art. Because it is a dimension now where one can not only creatively imagine, but one can bring forms out of that will have stability. Not stability in the universe, but stability in a differential way, an expanded universe. An artistic universe now. It has art in addition. And that art forms really are higher dimensional forms. In fact, there are 6-dimensional forms, because consciousness is a 5-dimensional process. But the 5th dimension is not factorable into it in an addition way. It factors into it in a deep transforming complementarity. So that anything that it touches, it will change it. It will give it the magic of transforming and of being able to come into a differential form. The process from consciousness that goes into the mind then is the process of remembering, because consciousness is a remembering. But when it goes into the mind, it exchanges, and as the imagination now has become creative imagining, remembering becomes the memory. So that the mind now has an infusion of something that it did not have originally and now has new. The ability to remember, which is different from just re-imaging. There are many life forms that can just re-image something, bring the image back up. And this process is akin to like dreaming. Animals dream. The dogs will be whimpering and their little feet moving as they're chasing something. Horses dream. Elephants dream. Cats dream. If you practiced yoga like I did in the high Sierra forests or the Himalayan forest, you know that trees have that ability as well. Plants have that quality. But dreaming images is distinctly different from having a memory as a structure, an integral structure in the mind. The mind now that has not only the imagination, which it gives to consciousness, absorbs remembering as a process and makes it into a form. So the memory now is able to think images, even images that were never there in nature. You can think of images from your imagination now being creative imagining, and they will register in the mind. You can think to yourself the image of a unicorn. You've never seen a unicorn, but you can have a very good image. I once did a course on world mythology, and I had about 150 students in it. This was in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And I had everyone draw their picture of a witch. independently, over 100 some students, there were many aspects to a witch, and almost none of them had ever seen a witch. Only images of a witch or their imagination, but there were warts on the nose, there were scraggly hair, the beady eyes, the crooked teeth. Almost all of the images had this. This was the image of a witch. And one can see this phenomenon again and again. What happens in science is that the creative imagining of visionary consciousness is the place, the locus, not the focus, but the locus as a process of theory. That theory is a different phase completely from symbolic mentality. The mind does not theorize. Consciousness is able to theorize visionarily. This is a huge change because it means now that there is no such thing as just a theory as a thing. A theory is a differential process of bringing together, but not bringing together in terms of a form, bringing together in a creative process. So that in order to have the theory take form, the theory must take form in some one, but it can't take its emergence into stability in the individuality of the symbolic mind. Nor can it take its stability in the ritual comportment of the physical material body. Theory, in order to have a place, a locus, where it can achieve stable form, needs an artistic person. Not only an artistic person, but we're used in the wisdom traditions of the planet to say a spiritual person. So that science will be resonantly cognate with the artistic person, with the spiritual person, with the artist. So that literally the cosmos is the perfect work of art, raised and expanded to the level of the real. So that the first initiation into being able to command the analytic of science is developing the facility to have an aesthetic presencing. Art is the first resonance of a harmonic that will then include science. And aesthetics becomes, when it really develops its accumulative powers, becomes analytic. So aesthetic presence is deeply related to analytic prescience. Prescience, by the way, is spelled pre-science. And what prescience means is that you know presciently, if I can use that made-up grammatical form, you know that such and such seems right because it is elegant. And so all mathematicians, all scientists, who are really major scientists, major mathematicians, will have a sense of the elegance of theory. That it has achieved a form where it really looks right, it seems right, it should be this way. That it shouldn't be messy, but it should have a beauty to it. It shouldn't be chaotic, it should have an elegance to it. And this is one of the deepest things in science. There was a very great math book that came out a couple of years ago, and it was dedicated to the teacher of the two men who wrote it. And they said, we still remember that he told us math is not just looking at the words, the equations, but it's hearing the music that comes from that. The whole orientation of teaching science as if it were a subject antithetical to art is a grave error and flaw, and one of the reasons why civilizations have not worked. Because civilization is a process and not a noun. It's a verb. Civilization is the history phase that bridges harmonically the arts and the sciences. And it is very similar to the way in which experience bridges the ritual body and the symbolic mind. And just as experience bridges body and mind, so that they really have an integral cycle together, they belong together, so art, history, and science belong together, but not in an integral way, in a differential way. So instead of having an alignment, they will have a resonance. And instead of having an identification, which is realizable, they will have a harmonic, which is expressible. And the expressibility, certainty of the harmonic differentially is that it is infinite. It's unbounded. Now, one of the big problems in 20th century math and physics and science, chemistry, was that when you do the equations on these advanced mathematical techniques, the equations bring out infinities that have to be taken out of the expression because there's no way for the mind in its habituated symbol integral completeness, there's no way that the mind in its own natural mode can understand how to work infinities in. And so the equations very often will have an expression where they'll have an elongated, like an old-fashioned S or an F, and that will be the integral. And at the top of the integral will be an infinity sign, and at the bottom will be a zero sign. And in order to get rid of the infinities that are there in the math all the time, one has to introduce, instead of the infinity in the top part of the integral, one puts in what is called a cutoff. And the cutoff usually is symbolized in higher math as an L. And this will be the limit, the liminal. And it turns out that you can have a very large L, and the approximation then of that equation to the experiments that are happening with the ritual comportment of objective actions and the experience of experiencing them and the symbolic mind of indexing and understanding them will be approximately very close to it. And that if you go through this process a number of times where you don't just do it once, but then you refactor in a second order another expression of it and a third and maybe a fourth, you keep getting a refinement that's closer. And it's closer in many ways, not just that the approximation is refining itself, but you're bringing in other aspects like the natural radiative quality of dissipation of entropy that's happening. And so all of this is factored in, and the equations become very refined, except what one has done is one has edited out the infinity, and this process is called renormalization. That now the equations are very, very close to what is actual in the experiments. So at the observation of the experiments and the theoretical handling of the math are extremely close with an accuracy of, say, 8, 10, 12, 15 decimal points. Good enough. Good enough because of a courtesy of mysterious nature who allows virtual experience in an incomplete universe to be realizable in the mind, almost to the point of exact identity, even though all of that is rather like a dramatic shell game. And that the exact reality is not findable in that way. Richard Feynman, because he was such a balance of the square of attention that had 1/2 integral and 1/2 differential, 1/2 symbolic mind, 1/2 playful artistic person, 1/2 experience in its widest free-flowing variations and consciousness in its widest asymptotic freedom. Because he had that kind of a balance, he found that he could look through not only the symbols of the mind in a normal, ordinary way that allows the transparency of symbols to show you beyond, but he could look through the math symbols as well. And he began to see that the math symbols were all the time playing with him, inducing him to believe what he knew was only partiality to be truth. And so he got tired of this, and being a creative genius, he made up his own symbols, and they're called Feynman Diagrams. Here's a guide to Feynman Diagrams in the many-body problem. Diagrammatica, the path to Feynman Diagrams, and one of my favorites, a recent book, very expensive, on Feynman's diagrams, entitled Drawing Theories Apart, the Dispersion of Feynman Diagrams in Post-War Physics. Because almost everyone now on the higher reaches of science use the artistic-inspired Feynman diagrams rather than the math. Even though the math has several thousand years of improvement and have been extended to extraordinarily refined abilities. The extraordinary refinement by 1930 had reached the point to where there were more math geniuses of the first order alive in the world than had lived in all the time before them. One of my favorite photographs from that era is the greatest mathematician of the day, David Hilbert, chatting with Albert Einstein, and they were both such math geniuses, but Hilbert said of Einstein that he was more of an intuitionalist, that anybody in his student population knew more math than Einstein, but that they didn't have the artistic intuition that he had to be able to squeeze out relativity, both the specific and general theories. One of the qualities that's there is when Feynman was developing his diagrams to express the math, it wasn't a symbolic diagrammatical form technically, like math symbols tended to be, because they had evolved out of a traditional cultural inculcated instruction. No one had ever instructed anyone in Feynman diagrams. He made them up himself, creatively. But he made them up out of his theoretical consciousness rather than out of his symbolic representation. And one of the qualities of theoretical, creative, visionary consciousness is that it is able to have a different mode from representation, and the mode is called simply presentation. So that a really strong, good scientific theory comes out of presentational consciousness rather than representational mentality. Which means in order to really train people for science, you have to mature them so that they will have this particular turn, this particular twist, that they stop depending exclusively on the integral cycle and are able to twist it and bring it around and have the differential cycle be related to a bit different, so that one doesn't call it a cycle, one calls it an ecology. So that the natural cycle and the differential ecology occur together, and of course the all-time great symbol for this is the infinity sign. But it also is the development of the Penrose transform, which is the essential of twistor geometry, which has become, like Feynman diagrams, one of the central ways of expressing the real now. Not just realization in terms of traditional symbols, but the real in complete, creative, new way of looking at reality, at everything. Twistor geometry and field theory. Twistors in math and mathematical physics. And here, one of the chapters, twistor diagrams and Feynman diagrams, of how these two capacities, when they're brought together in conjunction, you get a very interesting kind of an overlay. And what happens is this. You realize that thinkers like Hawking depend on the symbolic mind to carry the integral into a form which then will be representational and stable, but will include the consciousness that you're going to have some transforms. Feynman goes further in that he takes out the ritual body traction of existentials and extends it to include the form of differential art. And when he does so, now his diagrams are able to handle many body problems. Because as long as you base yourself on a mentality that has its traction in ritual objectivity, you limit your range of certainty. The certainty for someone like Isaac Newton was that he was able to relate two bodies together in the Newtonian universe, the gravity of two bodies pulling at each other. And just as the sun will attract the earth also attracts the sun, but since the sun is so much bigger, we don't notice that there is this reciprocal attraction, but it's handling two bodies, one body at a time in that kind of a tandem. By the time you get to Einstein with the Minkowski four-dimensional space-time, the whole Newtonian gravity has fallen apart. Because the mind will be indulging in a fictitiousness once the consciousness has reached out to the differential form of not only a four-dimensional space-time, but how that then reconfigures the entire universe so that now it is a universe of relativity where objects occur on a curved field and they attract each other because they're in a hyper-differential geometry of a four-dimensional space-time, but that four-dimensional space-time can now be opened up to more dimensions. More dimensions than four, and once you go into 5 dimensions and beyond, you begin to see that you're working now not with geometry that has lines, but a differential geometry that has functioning vectors that spread themselves over on a multidimensional sense of continuity that is not a field, it's not a sphere, it's not a torus, but rather it is interpenetrating fields. And so now you get something called quantum field theory, which is a leap beyond Einstein of several orders. But the math becomes so complex that almost no one can do it. And in fact, if one were to be technical, no one could do it because it always involves increasingly infinities. And without cutting it off, without approximating it, which is good enough for local four-dimensional space-time, works perfectly well on a planet, even works in a star system. You can even fudge and make it seem to work in a whole cluster of star systems. But as soon as you start to get to the really nitty-gritty of the very small and the very large, it completely breaks down because the infinities there are real. They're not imagined. They're not fictitious. And so there is yet a huge transformation, or one should say rather, because the correct way to speak about it at this point is a huge recalibration. It's a recalibration of the mind and of the world and of our persons, so that we are constantly real and not just approximately exact in some kind of cut-off, dramatic appearance, fictitious mode. We're ready as a species to be real. One of the reasons why other star system civilizations do not contact us openly is they don't talk to nations. They don't talk to planets. The minimum social world that they talk to are star system civilizations. That's the entry card. Because if there were any kind of contact before that, there would be an inability of those beings in that star system to develop a sense of the real for themselves. They will have received it as an inculcation from others. So it's very good reason. And it's not just a law, interstellar law, or a rule of nicety. It is an actuality, because any species that becomes matured to the point of being able to be real, as well as spiritual, as well as a mind, as well as a body, will have, instead of a square of attention, will discover that those four forms together as a completeness and as a perfection now no longer make a frame of reference, but it tilts itself so that it's a diamond. It's like a diamond of reality. And when you put the diamond of reality onto the square of attention, that's how you get a mandala. And that mandala will always have an eightfold completeness that is able to follow in nature a path integral and at the same time completely transform itself into a harmonic infinite array, an array of arrays, if one can speak that way. And it works like this. Just as Hawking and Penrose shared a superimposition of the phase of theory, of visionary consciousness, they also did not, and they share in the did not, the phase of nature. What happens is when the mind and visionary consciousness exchange memory and imagination, that's an interchange between those two, between the form and the process. But vision comes into play in that square of attention and takes the place of nature, and nature allows for this to happen. The natural process naturally allows for visionary consciousness to come into play as a phase of one's frame of reference. And so nature, in cooperating with theory, with theoretical consciousness, has not a replacement so much, but an exchange of phases. And so what you get is that nature now becomes, instead of the basis of existential physical reality, nature now becomes a phase space process. And as a phase space process, nature now has a protean capacity to bring into play and to make sure that the appearances and images and the existentials of it are as real as anything has been before. And so a visionary consciousness that plays in nature as a phase space creativity through this coming into its place, its phase place. Now what emerges existentially are new things that could not have emerged before. This is the way in which the natural variation of something becomes a creative possibility of playful exploration. The universe has variations, but the cosmos has play. And the play is always exploring possibilities. And one of the great things that art brings into not focus as a center, but into a lens as a prism, is that creative presencing has a prismatic quality to it, which very much now comes into play in creative ritual. Because creative ritual is just not about practical force or practical work being done in an engineering sense. But now, the ritual, objective action has a pragmatic quality. It doesn't just happen by sequence, it happens because the sequencing has many variations that still allow for the sequencing to happen, but with variations. And the pragmatic and the prismatic are able to complement each other in such a way that you now have an ability to have the ritual action of existence exchange places with the artistic differential form. And so art comes into play. And aesthetic presencing, instead of just being something which is for a refined few, becomes a constituent of the frame of reference of the way in which the world occurs. What goes out of phase is nature and ritual, but what comes into phase is vision and art. And when they come into phase, that's when, for the first time, you'll be able to get a balanced, not a balanced individual. No individual's ever been balanced. It's the spiritual, artistic person who is balanced. They're balanced with the symbolic mind. And they are balanced because there's a continuity of their experience and their consciousness, which flows. E. Cummings once had a poem that expressed it beautifully. He said it comes out like a ribbon and lies flat on the brush. When the flow of experience and the flow of consciousness are uninterrupted, they have a laminar flow quality. Just like with the space shuttle coming back in, that the little wedges in between the tiles were sticking up and it was going to create turbulence in the laminar flow. When someone is balanced, like a Richard Feynman, that their experience and their vision flow completely in an equanimity, that laminar flow comes into play with a kind of an oomph that registers both in the mind and in the art. And it registers in this way. It accumulates. It accumulates and builds. And now the spinal column, instead of just being a spinal column of bones and discs, cartilage, and nerves that would just hold the skeleton up, it now becomes a capacitator, a resonator, that allows for a special dynamic of other dimensions to come into play. And instead of having ritual steps, one now is able to have ballet. More next week.